I'm Christian from Chicago Yacht Rigging, and today we're going to do a little rig along, and we're going to be doing a rig and deck gear inspection on this J88. A rigging inspection is a really important part of keeping your boat in good condition and keeping you and your crew healthy and safe. We're going to look at as much as we can, just doing a visual inspection with the rig up, and we're going to talk about some other things you can do with the rig down. The timing on this, I always say the best time for a rig inspection is going to be in fall. That's because you can catch things and then fix them at your leisure over winter. Things will be cheaper since you don't have to rush on parts or service. For racers, I always like to do a rig inspection about 2 weeks before your next regatta, because that gives you plenty of time to fix things. It's nothing worse than finding a problem, realizing you need the part, and not being able to get it in time. This boat in particular is Dutch. It's a J88. It's a boat I've been working with for a couple years. It happens to be in really good shape, and it's kind of special as well because they just won the North Americans. So you'll find this boat is pretty well sorted. That said, we almost always find something when we start checking out a rig. Alright, so now it's time for the aloft portion of the inspection. Before you go aloft, it really helps to have a plan for how you're going to get up, what you're going to inspect, in what order, and what you're going to bring with you. Before we go up, it always helps to have a few tools with you. I always like to have a Swiss Army knife or multi-tool, tape. Obviously today we've got video, but normally I take along an old smartphone to use as a camera, and I've got a little leash on the back of this one. Always leash your tools when you're aloft. The other tools that I normally take with, but I'm not bringing today, a pair of side cutters for pins, and a nice Cobra Jaw adjustable wrench. Today we're just looking over the rig, so I'm not taking anything with to fix anything, because this rig is coming down in just a few days. So we're checking the track here. We're making sure the fasteners are all present. We're making sure there's no gaps in the track. We're making sure there's no burrs. Along the way up, I'll just use my hands and my eyes to try and figure out any problems. Alright, so here we are. We're at the first set of spreaders. There's a couple things we want to look at on any rig. You should have lower shrouds meeting the mast here. These are T-balls, so there's a couple things we want to look at. We want to make sure the rivets are in place, not moving. We want to make sure the T-ball itself, as much as we can tell, is showing no cracks. We want to make sure the wire is not showing any broken strands. This one looks okay. Let's go over here where the light's a little bit better. The other thing you want to look at, especially on T-balls, is the corner of that fitting right there has had some cracks in the past, so we always want to check those out. This particular rig has the rubber plugs. You want to make sure those are in. They're semi-optional for anything but running backstays, but this boat has them, so we want to make sure they're okay. Next, we're going to move up to the spreaders themselves. You want to inspect the mast around the spreader base for any deformation or cracks. This one looks okay. We also want to check the pins, make sure they're snug. You can feel the cotter pins through here. Pins are in place. There's no play, there's no funny motion in this spreader tip. So now we're going to go out to the tip itself. What we're looking at here is to make sure there's no broken strands where the wire goes over, making sure there's no loose parts, making sure that the tips can slide easily over the wire, making sure there's no cracking on the front or back edge of the spreader. Let's go over to the next one. We'll check the same thing here. Wire looks good. The plate's showing a little bit of wear on the tape, so if this rig wasn't coming down in a few days, we'd be checking that or replacing that. Screws seem well fastened. Wire looks good from the bottom. No cracks in the front or back edge. This is a racing boat, so they use a little keeper here to keep the spinnaker from getting caught in the shrouds. That means that when the spinnaker hits this, it just bounces right off instead of wedging here. You want to make sure that that's in good shape. If we needed to, we could retape that or retie that. And again, the whole way up, we're always checking the track, making sure there's no chips, no burrs, nothing that's going to stop the cars from rolling up and down cleanly. All right, spreaders the second. You want to do the same thing. On any rig, you just want to make sure all the parts are where they should be. Nothing's loose, nothing's showing damage. There's no motion where there shouldn't be. Mast walls look straight. Same thing on the tips. We're just making sure all the parts are in place. Nothing's loose, nothing's broken. And you can use your eyes and your hands. So the entire time I've been going up, I've been running my hand along the back side of the track here. Again, just making sure there's nothing that's going to cause the cars to fail, slide, wrong, or pop out. What? No, you're fine. Give me 1 second. Now there's all different kinds of spreader tips. This one is a pretty simple one with wire and a little plate to keep it captive. There's all different kinds of rigs in the harbor. You'll see things like rod tip cups. On those, you're going to want to make sure that all the parts are in place and nothing is rotating when it shouldn't. You want to make sure any set screws, if they're used, are in place. You want to make sure everything's taped and there's nothing sharp to snag your sails. Good to go. All right, so now we're here where everything comes together with the hounds. This is where the forestay and the upper shrouds meet. There's quite a lot going on, so take your time here. What we want to do is be checking things like shivs. Unless you're up on the shiv, you want to rotate the shiv itself and make sure everything's turning, no chips, no cracks. You want to make sure the forestay is pinned. You want to look for cracks in the forestay tang, cracks in the swedge, and especially on boats like this that have furlers, you want to make sure there's no twisting of the wire, or rather the wire's twisted it's supposed to be. You don't have a halyard wrap that's causing bird caging or cracked strands. Same thing on the T-balls up here. We always want to make sure where it goes into the mast is clean, no cracks on the backing plate. Same thing on the other side. We're checking those rivets. We're looking at the T-ball itself. And always, just like we're checking the mast track going up and down, we want to look at the wire. Make sure there's no deformation, no broken strands, no funky twists. A lot of boats with furlers really depend on having the right geometry between the jib halyard and the forestay. This boat was designed from the factory with it to be furled, so you can see when the jib is fully hoisted, the top swivel is right next to the halyard's jib, which is great. Some boats don't have that. They might have the forestay right above or even sometimes right next to the jib halyard shiv. In that case, you need something to make sure the halyard is pulled back, called a halyard restrainer or a deflector. And you just want to make sure that this jib halyard never has a lot of room at the top of the furler to start wrapping around if you get a bad furl. Other things we're looking about, speaking of shivs, we want to make sure the shiv cover plate in this case is nice and secure, nothing loose, nothing backing out. Pin is nice and clean. Sometimes these will give you a clue that something's wrong. If you see signs of rotation on the plate, could be the screws popped out, and that's a red alert sign to get that fixed. We'll talk more about the furling gear on the way down, but a couple things you want to look at. You want to make sure you have a top cap. This is a Mark IV from Harkins, so it's got a nice screw-in top cap. Some of the older ones have a kind of a glue-on cap. No matter what, you want to keep your sails and your halyards safe from the sharp metal edge of this foil. All right, so here we are at the top of the world. When you're at the masthead, there's quite a lot going on, just like at the Hound, so we want to inspect everything. We're checking the shivs for the masthead halyards. In this case, the single spinnaker. Cover plates are in. Shiv itself, if I wanted to, I could check this by, I'm on two halyards here. I always go on two. If I wanted to check this shiv, I could have them down at the deck, load up the main halyard to take the load off this one, then I could spin the shiv. Vice versa for the main, I could load the spin. Since this rig is coming down in just a few days, we're not even going to do that. Other things we want to look at, pins. This is a pin that's not in use for a 2-to-1 main halyard. Looks okay. We want to check the attachment for the masthead wind gear. That actually has a hair of play, so we're going to take our notes from this video and put a little action item for that. We're looking at the Windex, or most of the Windex. Normally, anytime you go up a rig, somebody on the bottom says, oh, and don't forget the Windex vanes. This one, I think we're just going to leave as is for now because the rig's coming down, but you can see it's broken there. The Windex itself is turning, so that's good. Always check the base. That's usually where these things go wrong. Speaking of bases, this boat has a backstay flicker. These are used to deflect the backstay out of the way of the leech of the main to make jibing and tacking easier. These always bear some inspection at the aft attachment point. That's the place that these usually fail, and it's because you do have a big hole, often some hardware on top, and it's right where it begins to bend, so that's always going to be the most stressed point. We've looked at the shrouds and the forestay. We also have to check the backstay. This is a Dyneema backstay. Pin's a little long. We'd probably want to change that when we get down, but up here it looks to be in good shape. Anytime you're looking at Dyneema rigging, there's a couple places you want to look at it. One is at the top terminal. Make sure there's no broken strands, no crushed looking deformed fiber. You also want to look at it where the flicker goes over. You can see this one was actually put in upside down. Oops. You want to make sure that the ring isn't abrading the Dyneema cover. This one's about 4 years old, but still looks great, so no worries there. And just like anytime you're looking at your rig or your boat, the more you look at it, the more pictures you take, the more things you're going to notice. So I'd say our action items would be check the shivs when we get down, get that flicker installed correctly, and probably get new Windex tacking angle vanes. But everything else looks great. The other thing we want to check again is that mainsail track. Tracks usually have issues at the ends or at the joints, and the top and the bottom are probably the most likely places to have issues. So this one looks just fine. The other place you want to check is where the headboard sits when reefed. A lot of times you'll have funky chafe like we do here on the back of the rig. You should probably put some paint on that. And you just want to make sure the track itself isn't damaged and the mast isn't damaged either. So we said we were going to check out the furling gear later. Well, it's later. There's a couple things I like to look at on any furler. After I've gone up the rig, I like to go down a different way so that I can look at something else. On some boats, I might go down the backstay if there's complicated things like radio SSB connectors, isolators, or a funky backstay setup like deflectors. On this one, the backstay is pretty straightforward. I'm going to go down the forestay so I can look at a few things. Things we want to check out: the connections between the foils. That's kind of a famous place for furlers to go wrong. Some of these J88 sections were actually assembled from the factory, or commissioned here rather, without 5200 and missing bushings. So anytime I get one of these open, I like to check that. If this rig wasn't coming down, we'd be using our screwdriver just to check all the individual screws. Mostly right now, I'm just going to look for missing screws, play in the joint, or anything wrong with the track. So to that end, I am going to use my halyard tail to clip on. So we are going to slide down the forestay, taking a look as we go. All right, down slow and steady. So mostly in between connections, we're just keeping an eye on the foils on the tracks, making sure there's no damage at the connectors. We're checking to make sure there's no missing screws, nothing loose, no bends, no kinks. If you have to change a connector on these J88s or any Harken Mark IV, it's actually quite easy, since the connectors all come apart into separate pieces and can be assembled without taking all the foils off. So same thing here, we're pausing there. Got all our screws, they feel fine. Track looks good. But the whole time you're up here, don't just be hanging out taking pictures for the gram. You gotta keep your eyes open and always be touching and looking at things just to see what you can find wrong. It's pretty rare to do a rig inspection and not find something. Although this boat's pretty well sorted, so this might be our exception. So I always joke that I'm a linear thinker, and I always like to kind of go in order from one end of the boat to the other. We're going to start at the front. This boat gets a little more in front than most because it's got an extending bowsprit. So what we're going to do a little later on, we're going to extend that bowsprit and get a good look at the parts. Some boats have a bobstay. That's always worth checking out, especially after a windy regatta. We replaced a number of those, and actually a few sprits as well after this windy Mac race. On boats like this that just use a hard fair lead for the tack line, you really want to inspect that and make sure there's no burrs. Those can be sanded off easily, but if not caught, they'll make short work of your tack line. Speaking of tack line, this one is a nice one. It's got a Dyneema chafe cover on it. You can see that's about where it sits when it's going downwind. And this one's actually in pretty good shape, even though it's older. The Dyneema chafe cover costs a little extra, but does extend the line. I would like to redo this soft shackle. You can see it's got some fraying in the strands. That's just from pretty hard use and rubbing on the tack ring of a spinnaker. It's not something I personally handle, but I always do like to check out the pulpit. Make sure you have no cracks in the connections. Make sure it's fixed to the deck, nice and rigid. I do lifelines, and they are kind of a pet peeve of mine, because oftentimes you'll see that people, even when they have the option to lash the lifelines, will lash right to this ring here. This is welded on. It's about the weakest part of the whole system. So Dutch has done the right thing here and actually gone through the eye and around the tube. The tube is never going to break. I've actually gone swimming on a boat when we lost one of these eyes, so I always like to check that when I hop on. Also attached to the pulpit, This boat has some nice kind of keeper lines to keep the jibs and sails and crew on board. Always check these, make sure they're not fraying there. This one uses these nice rope-eye, glue-on-eye straps, and I do see some chafe there, so this is probably an action item for next winter. Before we leave the front, we've got to go over one of the most problematic parts of most boats, and that's the furling system. This is a Harkin Mark IV underdeck Unit 0, and it's actually a pretty good furler, but nevertheless there's a couple things we want to check. You want to look at the swivel, make sure it swivels. You also want to check a few details. You want to make sure the shackles are in good shape. This one's been taped and popped through, that's fine, we could replace that. You want to make sure these rings are in place. We've had a couple boats lose the rings, usually when slamming this down, and you lose all the bearings. This boat has opted for this nice little low-profile Selden snap shack. I think it's a 406-04001, and it's nice because it doesn't take up much more space than the bow shackle, but it also gives you the ability to snap the head and the tack on. We've got that down here as well. Speaking of down here, I don't know if you can see, but inside there is another smally ring, another snap ring, and if that ever lets go, this furler drops down about a ½ inch, which seems fine, but all the bearings fall out underneath, which can be a real problem because you have to take the entire thing apart in order to fix it. The other thing we always want to check, and we'll look at this more during our up-the-rig inspection, you want to check the connectors. The connector is the place where the two foils join. You can kind of see the joint there. There's another one up there. You want to make sure that the screws are nice and tight. You want to make sure there's no cracks or play around the connection itself. Similar to that, we want to check the feeder. This is a really nice feeder. It comes in and out with one screw, but you want to make sure that screw is nice and tight. If this rig wasn't coming down in a few days, we'd be taking that Allen wrench to that and just double checking that as well. Below the deck, there's not just spiders, there's a couple things we want to look at. On these underdeck furlers, there's not a lot of clearance between the bottom of the spool and the housing, so you want to make sure your knot isn't too large. Some boats have started using a hog ring. I really just like a tapered furling line so that your knot can be quite small. You do want to check that this block, or in some cases fairlead's in good shape. Same for this one and this one. And everything's spinning, looks good. So we're going to move on back. When you're looking at lifelines, there's a couple things you want to keep an eye on. These are the screw type. So this is a threaded stud that screws into the eye. I always put those in with blue Loctite, so it should still be put, but you always want to put a wrench on this and give it a little twist to make sure. You want to make sure there's no broken strands. So you can kind of feel around here. You can give the lifeline just a little flex, because that will usually show a broken strand if there is one. This boat has some nice rollers, some big PVC tubes over stopper balls. You want to make sure those are in good shape. If they get cracked on the ends, they can start to cut the lifeline. We're seeing, looks like, yep, the same chafe on these keeper lines, so that'll be an action item for this winter. Moving our way aft, we get to a fairlead. This is also for that jib furling line. Make sure this is nice and fixed in the deck. Sometimes these do come loose. Line itself is looking a little ragged, but not that bad. Here we have a pretty common issue on a JD8, and this one's been fixed. This pad eye on JD8s tends to deform over time, so this has been replaced with a forged pad eye, which is stronger. There's a little deformation on the deck there, so we probably want to look at that. Our jib car control line, this is a couple years old, but it's not bad. The bungee's nice and new, no chafe in that. When we get to the tracks, anytime you have a track, you want to inspect and make sure there's no fasteners going proud. When there's problems with the track, it usually happens at the front or the back, and I'm seeing no fasteners. You can use your hand to go ahead and make sure nothing's proud sticking up. Check the bearings. Mostly you just want to roll these. The only maintenance these really need is soap and water. Blast out the gunk. You don't ever want to use lubricants on a Harkin ball bearing track or any plastic ball bearings, because they will make the balls slide instead of roll, and that can make them flatten out and make them really rough. This jib car is one of the nice ones. It's feeling fine, no chips. The #1 killer of jib sheets is not bad crew mistakes, it's little burrs on these rollers, so always keep an eye on that. Here we are at some pretty complicated real estate. When they built this boat, they really wanted the stanchion right next to the shrouds, and that's made kind of hard to adjust these, so there's a lot going on right here. A note on stanchions: anytime you get to a stanchion, give it a little wiggle, make sure it's not loose, make sure it's not lifting off the deck, make sure no water comes out when you move it. Check these ferrules where the lifeline goes through the stanchion. Make sure there's no damage. Make sure the lifeline itself isn't broken. That's a pretty common place for lifelines to get little broken strands. When it comes to inspecting the bottom of the standing rigging, we're going to do the top later, but the number one place for standing rigging to fail is right here, where the wire goes into the swedge. And that's because this is a high flex spot. It's also where water drips down and causes crevice corrosion, so always check that out. Again, you can give it just a little flex to see if anything looks funny when you move it. This boat's in great shape. You do want to check, make sure there's, as far as you can tell visually, no weird rust stains, no cracks occurring, nothing funky going on there. My rule of thumb is when I'm on a boat, any boat, I try and take as many pictures, in this case video, but as many pictures as I can from as many angles, so it gives me a good reference for coming back to later. So I can figure out where something was, how it was led, whether it looked okay. This boat has got these, the little cut-off ratchets to adjust the shrouds. Again, everything's really crowded in here. These do go bad kind of fast, so kind of keep some spares on these because there's a lot of mild steel parts in there that will rust. When you're looking at pins, I'd really like to see that tape, but again, this boat's coming out in a few days. My own personal preference is to use cotter pins, short and bent only slightly open. I don't like the rings. I've actually had those come out while racing and had some exciting moments. Don't want that. You want to check the toggles. If this boat was staying in the water, we'd probably pull this tape and make sure there's no cracks there on the bent toggle or there on the T-bar. As well as you can, you want to check the chain plates. Make sure there's nothing that looks like or feels like cracking. Make sure there's no weird weeping rust stains. Your eyes and your hands can do a lot of the work for you. So just feel, look, and just make sure there's nothing that looks out of sorts. Continuing our way back, we've got a whole lot of hardware here. Anytime you pass a block, you want to get your hands in there, make sure the shiv is round, make sure there's no chips, make sure it turns. Anytime you pass a cleat, we like to open it up, make sure it's got a nice snap, that the spring is strong and the ball bearings are in place. If these are ever seized open and don't want to turn, it may be too tight. If they ever open and don't want to close, it's probably the spring. You can get a rebuild kit, but oftentimes it's just easier to replace the whole cleat. Talking about hard fair leads, these are getting more and more common, especially on J-boats like these. It doesn't look like there's a lot to go wrong with these, and there isn't, but you do want to check and make sure they're tight to the deck. This one has a little bit of a wobble. The other thing we've noticed on some J111s is that the sheets will actually wear through the anodizing, and look what we've got here. Allowed to continue, that little wear spot would probably get bigger and it can eventually cut the sheet. We noticed we were losing sheets on some boats and it didn't make sense because it wasn't at the winch and it wasn't at the in-hauler. So keep an eye on this. The fix is just flip it around and then eventually replace it. All right, we've got a little pad eye here, a little folder. You just want to make sure that these are in good shape, no weird stains. They articulate. You can put a screwdriver on this and make sure it's turning, or not turning. Speaking of turning, we've got a deck block. Anytime you encounter a block like this, there's a couple things we want to do. We want to make sure there's nothing going on underneath. Again, no rust stains. We want to make sure the fasteners are nice and tight. We could put an Allen wrench on these. You want to make sure that the shiv itself is clean, no chips, no burrs. You want to make sure it's rolling and there's no slop. This one feels great. When it comes to winches, the way to inspect a winch is really just to rebuild it. You should do that once or twice a year. But if you're just checking, you want to do the sound test. Make sure it sounds okay. Make sure both speeds are working. Make sure the self-tailer's in the right spot. Make sure everything's nice and tight and the securing ring's in place. We're all the way to the back now. Same thing, we just want to be checking the ends on our lifelines, make sure they're lashed in place correctly, make sure the eye is secure, make sure there's no broken strands where it passes through the ferrules on the stanchions, make sure this push bit here is nice and secure to the boat. The next thing we're going to do is start to work on some of the deck gear. Let's begin back here. The backstay, it's a nice cascading backstay, all the lengths look right. What you want to do is trim and ease this a few times, just so you can make sure that there's no funky wear on the cascades. These lines where it goes through a block and applies, purchase power, it's called a cascade. And on this boat, I think we got it pretty right, where if you ease it out, all the cascades kind of stop at the same time. If you ever see boats with a huge gap on one cascade and no gap on the other, it's wrong and should be corrected. But what I'm doing here is just using my eyes, using my hands to make sure there's no chafe on these. They're a couple years old, they still look in decent shape, but I think this might be something we'd consider replacing for winter. Just because they are getting a little worn up here where they ride in the blocks. I want to make sure all the shackle pins are tight. Make sure if there's a locking head post, it's in place. I would probably tape all those rings. And we also want to look over the backstay itself as well. This one's pretty easy. There's nothing broken on it, nothing showing signs of fray. We've got carbo blocks in the system, same kind of thing. We just want to make sure the shivs feel good, turn well. Make sure if there's any soft attachments, they're not showing funky chafe. This one looks pretty good. These cheek blocks tend to go bad because the angle's a little high, so you always want to give them a turn. Just make sure there's no loose bearings and the shiv feels good. Working our way back through the boat, another busy area. We've got the main sheet set up. There's a few things you want to look at here. You want to make sure all the blocks in the system are okay. We just replaced this one, so it should be fine. Make sure the swivels are swiveling if they should, or they're locked if they shouldn't turn. You want to make sure the ratchets, the selectors work, or the auto ratchets work. You want to make sure they turn in one way and lock in the other. You want to make sure the cam cleats are in good shape. Same thing, just give them a little twist open. Check the fasteners on the bottom. Check the swivels. So many of these things, if you just kind of play with the object, you can usually tell if it's in good shape or not. When it comes to the traveler, you just want to make sure it travels. So we'll move it back and forth a couple times. You can go from one end of the track to the other. Make sure there's no dings or burrs on the track. Make sure the bearings sound good. Again, maintenance is just soap and water on these. You don't want to add anything extra that's going to cause those balls to start sliding around and wearing themselves out. This boat has lots of little chafe patches everywhere, and these just make it easier when you're trimming to avoid damaging the line or the boat. You want to make sure those are in good shape. We should probably replace this one. As you're checking through your lines, this would be a very long video if I did the whole thing, but you want to go over kind of every foot of the line. Run it all the way through your hands. Make sure there's no flat spots, no shiny spots, no signs it's been overloaded, no signs it's been chafed. Funny little aside on this particular line, red lines always wear out the fastest. They fade the quickest, especially when the red dye is applied to fibers like Cordura and Dyneema. It just doesn't stick. So even though this line's about 2 years old, it looks like it's 5. So I happen to know the age on this one, but if I saw this at first, I might be a little concerned. So going up to the boom, one of the midnight on a regatta calls I get most often is for the outhaul system. It's a system you don't think about because you just hook it up. Sometimes you leave the same main on all season and you just don't think about it. I always like to ease these all the way out so I can inspect the pennant. The pennant's the part that comes out. Inspect the shackle. If I can, I like to take the boom apart and see the whole thing. It's just one of those things that stays hidden until it's a problem, so we like to address that. Check your outhaul and reef line shivs. Check your boom attachments. We've got these little inset pad eyes here. The set screws are good. There's a little wear on the bail. It's not too bad. Your strop is okay. Let's go around to the sunny side. Speaking of outhaul, this boat has kind of a funny little upgrade that I like quite a lot. What it is, it's the outhaul, which I can trim from there, is on a bungee, so that if you trim out a bunch of outhaul, you don't have that hanging in the cockpit. That's because it's got a bungee that just runs inside the boom on the reef shiv. A little keeper to keep your crew from getting strangled. Looks like these guys have added a little dial for telling how much outhaul tension they have. That's cool. Moving your way along the boom. In the middle, there's not that much that can happen, so you just want to make sure the tube is straight, make sure any cleats or fastenings are okay. A little deformation on that eye strap. The block's okay. Make sure the cleat feels okay, not too sharp, not too worn. Goosenecks are another hidden problem area for pretty much every sailboat. There's a number of components that all move, all have a lot of load, all have a lot of random loads. You know, there's shock loads that all come through this part of the boat, so you want to make sure the pins feel solid, secure. Make sure there's no play in the pins that way. Make sure there's no play in the pins this way. Make sure they're secure. This one uses a pin. Some of them have a nut. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten on the boat and gone to check the nut and it just falls right out in your hand. So check everything, move everything, you know, swing the boom from side to side. Make sure you get pictures and your hands on every part of this. This one looks pretty darn good. Make sure the shackles are nice and straight. This one's not the perfect design because the head digs into that plate on the gooseneck. Make sure all the hardware on the mast when you get to the bottom of the mast is nice and secure. You don't want to have something coming loose in the middle of a regatta. This boat's got a pretty simple mast step. You do want to make sure everything's sitting correctly. You want to make sure your bolts are nice and secure. Mast-based blocks are another thing that tends to work their way loose over time. You know, we've got kind of a variety here. We've got a block with a shackle, and that looks pretty good. There's a little bit of wear on the plate there. We've got a block with a loop. You should check that out. This one probably is time to replace. I think we did that about 4 or 5 years ago. Down at the vang toggle, it's just like the gooseneck. You do want to check every part. Make sure there's no funny play. Make sure there's nothing about to come loose. Give it a wiggle and just make sure. There's a tiny wiggle there, but that's normal. When it comes to the rigid vang, there's a lot going on in a small space, so you do want to check its function. You can grind the vang down, make sure the spring is okay, make sure it's adjusted, it's holding up the boom properly, make sure your pennants are in good shape, make sure the shivs are in good shape, check the pins, check all the fasteners, check the blocks, check the line. There's a lot going on there, so it really pays to take your time, more time than I'm giving it, to look this over. So the number one complaint we get in rigging, and it's not even close, is ropes and clutches and them not getting along. That's because, especially as sails and ropes have evolved, there's less and less stretch in our gear, and so all the load from a halyard goes into one tiny little spot where the clutch and the line meet. There's a way to check this on, for example, this XTS. You can open it up and inspect the teeth and make sure there's no wear showing. On this one, for example, you can see that there is some wear. That's where it's shiny there. That's where the anodizing has been worn away and it's now into bare metal. Once you start seeing that, that means first it's going to start to slip, and then as this wear gets worse and worse, it's going to make little half moon shaped knives on the cam, and then it's going to start to cut your line right in half. I can't tell you the last time I actually had a halyard fail in the core, but it's a pretty regular occurrence that people lose the halyard at the clutch. And there's a really easy way pre-regatta to check that out and make sure you're not going to be one of those. So what I've done is I've taken the end of the halyard and I've attached the tail end with the reeving eye to the shackle end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this halyard to full hoist. And when I do that, I'll be able to do a quick inspection of the halyard, the cover rather, where it sits in the clutch, and that'll tell me how much life this halyard has left in it. Like I said, it's almost unheard of to have a halyard fail at the splice or in the core, but it's quite common and quite preventable to have the line go here. So here you can see we're at full hoist, and this halyard has got a bulk in it. That's where we increase the size of the rope on the inside, and you can see there is some wear, but it's not that bad. This is just very slightly worn. This one's in good shape. It's probably about 3 or 4 years old. There's a little dent there, there's a little chafe there, but it's not too bad. So the rig doesn't really stop at the deck. We're down below deck now to take a look at some of the hardware from underneath, to take a look at some of the running rigging and some of the other components like the bowsprit. Let's take a quick look at his sheets. These are tapered jib sheets, so the front is just a Dyneema covered, so it's skinnier, it's slicker, it's tougher, and it handles the in-haulers really well. We want to look at the point at which it gets in-hauled, which is right about here, I think, and that actually looks great. The other thing we want to do is figure out the point at which it gets winched, because that's where the rest of the wear is. And it's tough to tell on an image, especially in bad light, but you can kind of see that this is starting to get fuzzy. And there's a couple things going on here. If you were to feel it, you'd feel that the blue part of this is starting to get a little crispy. That's because the blue part is a polyester, kind of your standard cover fiber, and the black part is Technora, which is the tougher one. In this case, the black Technora is getting very fuzzy, and the blue is getting very kind of hard and crispy. When it gets crispy like that, it's been melted from high load and high friction. And although there's no cuts in these, it's probably time to start thinking about a new set of sheets. I think these are from when they got the boat, so that's getting kind of old. On the spin sheet, there's a couple things we want to look at. We do want to check out the pigtail. These are kind of a consumable item. This is the part that gets tied onto the clew to extend the clew away from the forestay and jibes. This one's not in bad shape. A couple popped strands from the splice, but there's no actual broken strands. The other thing we would do is lay this line out and kind of run it through our hands, and we'd be doing the same thing, feeling for those crispy spots on this line. This one's a couple different fibers. The gold is Technora, the white is Dyneema, the purple is polyester, and these sheets are not terrible, but they're starting to show some kind of crispy spots. They're probably about 3 or 4 years old. I think they're okay for now, but in a real rigging inspection, which I won't put you through on camera, I would feel every foot of this line running it through my hands. The other thing you can do while you're down here, start inspecting your deck hardware. It's very easy for something, especially like these T-nuts, to come loose over time. You also want to inspect for signs of rust, which is water getting into the boat underneath the hardware. Whatever this is here, it's starting to show some signs of rust underneath, so we want to take that piece of hardware off and reseal it. These are for the clutches. They're looking pretty good. This is for a little pad eye. That's okay. Some cleats back here. I added these, but these are original and they're starting to look kind of old. That's for the in-hauler. So anytime you see rust stains like that, it's probably time to pop it off and reseal it. You want to check the fasteners on the handrails, make sure everything's nice and tight. For your chain plates, #1 sign is going to be water or rust signs. You want to make sure there's none of that. Make sure all the bolts are tight. Make sure your grounding straps are tight. Down here we have the pull itself, the pull out controls, and their takedown reel. On this one's pretty simple. You just want to make sure the brackets are holding it in good shape. This carbon's actually feeling a little rough. I would probably wrap this in some Millionaire's tape, some Teflon tape. You can see they've got quite a few tapes around the hatch up here. That's just to make sure you don't spend money on midnight repairs on kites. This is the wide Millionaire's tape. It's just Teflon with an acrylic or a silicone backing. Probably needs to be renewed after that busy regatta. On the pole, there's a couple things you want to do. You want to make sure the pole outline is led correctly and everything's in good shape. There is a block up there that tends to wear out, but I know we just changed that one. Want to make sure the block back here is in good shape. Want to make sure, I think I've got the tack line up there, but want to make sure you slide the pole out. Check for any damage where it sits at full extension. Check for any damage on the tip. If there's any nicks or dings in the pole, you want to clean those up right away because they can start to affect the bearings. And once those get sloppy, the pole gets more point loaded and can break. But while you're down here, just check every little bit of hardware. Things like jig tracks are notorious for leaking. Check the mast compression post, or if it's a keel step mast, check and make sure that's correct. Make sure the partners are in good shape. Again, it's just like everything else in a rig inspection. You just want to spend as much time putting your hands and your camera and your eyes on all the hardware. All right, so there you have it. We've looked over pretty much every inch of this J88 Dutch. Congratulations to them again on winning North Americans. I hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully you learned something. If I was to give you any takeaways, it's be thorough, take your time. I like to do these alone so I can really focus and not get in conversations. The best tip I think I have is to use a camera to document everything. Oftentimes I find just when I'm setting up the shot to capture a piece of gear, I'll notice something about it that's off. The other tips would be go front to back, go top to bottom, do the whole system, and again, take your time because this is really important for your safety and the condition of your boat. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Happy sailing. Take care.